Today, I'm going to talk about TwinSAFE group ports. Now, the group ports are available under the variable mapping section of your safety application language worksheet right here. It's in the tab just to the right of the standard variables that you would use within your application. Now, I've created a project here that's going to allow us to pull all the levers to activate all of these individual outputs, as well as trigger this module fault on the input. Now, before you start creating standard alias devices to map all these outputs to your standard PLC project so you can see diagnostics in your HMI or do whatever else you might need to do with them, be aware that all of this is already available inside the info data. You should already have the info data activated for your group right here, and then those will show up in the IO tree as variables that you can use. So let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to go online with my safety project, and really I have two safety projects. Let's start at the bottom level. So first I have an EL 1918 that is running with local IO. In this case, I'm simply taking input one and I'm feeding it out to a virtual connection to a second group within the EL 1918 right here. And then I'm feeding that out through a custom FSOE connection to an EL 6910 as an additional input on this e-stop block. And then I have two contacts from an additional e-stop block right here heading to this e-stop out, which is e-stop OK. So let's start triggering some of these group ports. First, FB error. FB error simply indicates that somewhere within that worksheet, within that group, there's a function block that is in an error state. Let's trigger that right now. We're going to create a discrepancy error within this safe e-stop block. We can see that now we have a discrepancy. Both contacts no longer match. I've now triggered an FB error. Next, I'll create a COM error. Now, remember, I have a custom FSOE connection between my EL 1918 and my EL 6910. So all I'm going to do is disconnect the EL 1918 and we'll see that COM error. Go back to our variable mapping, our group port, COM error shows up here. So let's reconnect. The next group output port is other error. Now, this one can be triggered in a number of different ways. It can be triggered by a module fault, which is right here. We're going to talk about that in a few minutes. An analog value fault, such as an overrun on an analog signal coming in, or a wait COM timeout fault. So we're going to trigger this one in just a little bit. Next one is COM startup. Now, we should have seen that one show up immediately alongside our COM error because we couldn't reach that EL 1918. The COM link is trying to reestablish connection. Therefore, we see a COM startup state. So let's see that again. So now we see COM startup. So this isn't an error necessarily. It's simply that that connection is trying to start up. Next is FB deactivate. Now, this has to do with the customization settings for our individual groups. So what I'm going to do is go back to this EL 1918 in group 2, where we have a decouple of the actual input, then feeding to a virtual connection to the EL 1918 group 1 decouple. And we can see in this case, we have permanent deactivation true, which means that we can deactivate this group. So let's go ahead and do that, and we'll see how that shows up in the group port. Now within TwinCat, we see that the group is in a state deactive right here. But if we're not using TwinCat, we can use the group port to identify the exact same information right here. The group ports that we're not really talking about a whole lot are ones that hopefully you're already familiar with. The first is the run stop input, which is coming from a standard alias device, and then that gets linked to either a standard task process image or your standard PLC or something of that nature. The other is error acknowledge right here. We'll see that reflected up here. Down on the bottom, the first line is FB run. That means that all the individual function blocks within that group are in a run state. The next one is in run. That's for the entire group. Next, let's take a look at module fault. This one is special in that it only applies to TwinSAFE devices that have IO. So inputs or outputs or both, as well as logic. Really, this is for devices like the EK1960, where we have blocks of inputs, blocks of outputs, and those are all related modules. So this block of 4 outputs is a module, the other block of 4 outputs is a module, inputs, so on and so forth. What this allows us to do is use modules that might be associated with another group, bring them back into the group that we're working with, and trigger a fault in this location. So we can really control how those module faults, how those hardware faults affect individual pieces of code. So let's see it work. In my EL1918 group 2, I'm going to go down to my second network. In this case, I have my EL1918 module fault 2, drag that over a little bit, feeding into this decouple block, and then I'm pushing that to group port module fault. Keep in mind this group port module fault is not a free for all. It's really intended for module errors to trigger a group fault on the same device. So this is how it works. I'm going to take 24 volts and I'm going to feed it directly into the input of module 2. So in the EL1918, input 2 is module 2. So we can see that we have a fault and we've now triggered other error. So module fault, it was a rising edge. We didn't see it fast enough. It did trigger it, but at the end of the day, what we're really pushing is other error. Hopefully this provides you some guidance on how to use group ports within TwinSAFE.